I was just reflecting as I was putting this PowerPoint together last night that one of the slides, I think it's the second or third slide that I'm coming to, I first put together in 1998 and I've been trading off it ever since. The reason I mention that is that we were living at a very different time. And what arose out of the curriculum developments that took place back at that point are very, very much determined by the political context, the social context of the time. And I just want to make that point up front before we move on. But let me see if I can get this to move on now.
Yeah, that's working.
Oh, is that working? Yeah, okay. Right. Okay. There are... Citizenship Education has been a statutory part of the Northern Ireland curriculum since 2007. It was piloted over a number of years, starting in 1998. And since very early on in that piloting phase, there were four main dimensions to it. And I apologise if I'm teaching you to suck eggs here, but I think it's just important to get the ground right before we move on. And those are the four dimensions to it there, which may seem relatively unproblematic. And in a way, I suppose they are. But certainly Bernie and probably Alan will remember one Christmas when there were stories coming out of CCA of doors being slammed and resignations being threatened over what was on that particular slide. That there was great reluctance about some aspects of what was going on there. That there was a lot at the time to be fought for. And there was a lot of disagreement. But that's what we came to in the end. And I suppose there's a kind of development through it, beginning with pupils' initial experience of diversity around them, which you meet every day, and then starting to think about the challenges that that diversity poses in terms of inclusion. And then if you recognise you have a diverse society that you want to be inclusive, then you start thinking about social justice and equality, how we formalise those relationships to make sure that everybody is treated properly as they should be. Underpinning all of that is that idea of human rights and social responsibilities. And then that takes us on to how we shape our society. So there's a kind of progression through all of that, although what we aimed for was a lot of flexibility. There were a number of characteristics that sat alongside the programme, which included, first of all, that those concepts were intended to be or were recognised as being problematic. They were open to differing, changing, conflicting interpretations. No two people might necessarily agree on any one of them, and even one person's view may change over time, and so on and so on. So this was not about answers. This was about questions, about defining concepts and investigating those concepts through issues that were important to teachers and to young people. The second dimension was that all of this has to be investigated in local and global contexts, that there needed to be a balance between the hard local stuff that's really difficult to get into, and we still haven't cracked that, I don't think, but also the wider stuff that we can learn from on a global scale, and that has to be balanced, otherwise the potential for learning is lost. It was critical that all of this was driven by active and participatory methods, again because it was question-driven, that this was not about the teacher standing at the front of the room, putting PowerPoints up so that kids could copy the notes down. That was the last thing I think that we wanted to see happen. We were caught in a dilemma of giving this to teachers as a new thing to teach without a great deal of experience, and yet wanting them to have the freedom to teach what they cared passionately about. The balance that we struck, and I don't know really if we got it right or not, I think it wasn't too far off, was that we produced, Bernie largely did this work, we produced teaching packs, big purple folders that you still see sitting around schools today. But we always told teachers when we gave them out, chuck this out. When you don't need it anymore, put it in the bin. That it's something to get started with, but this is not the be-all and end-all of what citizenship education should be about. I'll show you another slide in a moment which expresses that a little more eloquently. And the final point to come back to is that it was inquiry-based, that we did not want to have a model citizen that we wanted young people to aspire to be, that there were not a set of qualities or attitudes or take your pick, whatever, that were the right answer. I think a lot of teachers had noted that in their experience of teaching issues around EMU, and this isn't to be critical of EMU because it did a lot of really good work, but there was often a sense with pupils that when you asked questions, there was almost like an answer section at the back of the book, and they knew exactly what those answers were and that you wanted them to say them. So they would say them and then move on to the next thing, and well, that wasn't too bad, was it? And what we wanted to do was to try to get pupils to engage in a much more authentic type of discussion and conversation. Okay. I want to remind you too just of where we were with the political context around some quite specific things. The Good Friday Agreement signed what, April 1998? The pilot of citizenship education was established in August of that year. We weren't really talking seriously at that stage about giving up weapons. The elections for the Assembly happened that year, and the Assembly met in shadow form for the first time, but without any real powers. Shortly after that, powers were devolved in 1999. And then the Assembly was suspended in 2000, 2001, twice, 2002, and it wasn't re-established until 2007. I often used to joke that whenever the pilot was going on, we weren't really sure if there was going to be a government at the end of the week or not, but whenever I look back at that, I'm reminded that that was actually the truth. That there was no sense that this absolutely was going to work out. There was still such hostility among some of the politicians, and yet there was such a strong sense of hope of what was now possible now that we had this document. And I think one of the key things that we really wanted to do was to give young people the sense that they had a role to play in all of this, that they should be talking about what kind of society we wanted to live in. They should understand how ultimately they would be able to shape policy and help steer politicians and so on, at whatever level they wanted to be. But this wasn't just about high-level stuff going on at Stormont. The whole of our society needed to be involved in a discussion and a debate about where we were going, and that was the job of the citizenship teacher, at least in part, to facilitate that. Okay, aims. That's quite small, isn't it? Sorry about that. First of all, I think looking back, I would have probably denied this at the time, but we did have a very transformative agenda. It was about bringing change, both within schools and classrooms, but also within wider Northern Ireland society. Shortly after this, it was while we were still working on the project, I was doing a master's degree up there, and I went and interviewed a very senior official in the Department of Education who was responsible for giving us a lot of funding for citizenship training, and asked her why she had committed that level of funding. You probably know who this is, do you? And she said, well, I wanted to be able to say something good if people in the future ever asked me, what did you do when you were finally given the power? And this was her answer. It was done out of real conviction and real motivation at that time, a genuine desire to make a difference. But the other interesting thing she said was the bottom one. Next to that, the key thing was introducing active and participatory methods into schools and using us as the thin end of the wedge to drive it in. Or maybe a Trojan horse. That's fine. I don't mind that description. But also there was a lot of conversation around supporting this transition that we were in away from violence and towards a more peaceful, more stable society, and showing young people that there were alternatives to violence and what specifically those alternatives were. You know, if you cared passionately about something in your neighbourhood, and in the past, the natural thing to have done might have been to go out and do something violent. What was it that you could do instead? On a more, I suppose, conceptual level, what we were keen to do was to create a concept that was driven by human rights, it was underpinned by human rights, that if we tried to do a lot of this work without an underpinning values base, well, what would stop somebody from saying, well, Northern Ireland would be a much better place if we had no Catholics, let's just get rid of them. You needed some kind of values base in there that was agreed, and human rights was it. And in that context, to begin to discuss really serious issues that young people cared about, not just ones chosen by the teacher, but ones chosen by them, and to talk about those things around what kind of society we want. We also wanted to try to create opportunities for thinking about new ways of being a citizen, new ways of thinking about old problems, new ways of doing. And I think those are fairly high aspirations. I don't think we've met them. I don't think we've even come close. But those were the kind of thoughts that were going on in our heads at the time. I think it was probably fair to say it was less about attitudinal change and much more about helping young people to understand how to live in a diverse society as a citizen of that society. You'll notice there's nothing about national identity. There's nothing about loyalty or obedience or the Queen or anything like that for obvious reasons. Okay. Sean gave me a piece of paper with a number of things to address on it, and one of the things he wanted me to address was, did we deal with repair, reconstruction and redress? And there's two answers to that. The first answer is yes, and the second answer is no. Both simultaneously true. The reason being that it was conceived of as being a very flexible curriculum in which teachers and pupils together chose the way to explore the concepts that I outlined above. I suspect it felt about, I don't know if you can read that middle line, can you?
Some assembly required?
Yes, like an IKEA snowman, some assembly required. And that's what we wanted teachers to think, that they were co-creators of this curriculum, that they needed to be engaged and involved in what they were doing. So if issues around repair, reconstruction and redress were important in their context, then yes, absolutely, they had to be right in there. But in general terms, the thrust of what was happening was deliberately identified as being future orientated, that it was about building a new, better future, not about dealing with the past. And with hindsight, I'm not sure that we got that entirely right. The motivation for it was absolutely right. But I think part of the picture was that we envisaged history as dealing with the past. And what we were keen to deal with was that point where the rubber hits the road today, now, where those issues from the past impact on us. And I think that's a reasonable hope and expectation. Again, how effective that has been, I'm not sure. Also, each of the four paired concepts that I showed you right at the start was envisaged as being a lens through which you could view an issue, so that each lens would show you a different dimension of that issue, so that you could consider, say, one issue, say that of victims, through each of those different lenses and see different aspects of that. So that would be the yes. You could do it in all bits of the citizenship curriculum. The no would be you didn't have to do it at all. Teachers and pupils choosing the issues. Okay. Now, what were the issues, or what are the issues for teachers and pupils in dealing with this? This is the easy bit because there are loads of issues in dealing with it. There are loads of difficulties, and I'm sure I'm not even naming them all. There are others in this room who can name them more effectively than me, but to me these are some of the key ones. First of all, the curriculum context. Initially, citizenship education was seen as a discrete subject. On some of the first drafts of the curriculum review, it was going to be allocated, if memory serves, 5%. Is that right, Bernie? And there was a whole argument about that. Schools hated having time dictated to them in a percentage like that. So that was chucked out. And fair enough, I can see that. But then what happened was the guidance that went with citizenship was that schools should deliver this in the best way they thought appropriate. That could be cross-curricular, it could be discrete, it could be over break time, it could be in the principal's head, which I think it often was. Well, that's maybe exaggerating a little bit. So the curriculum context was no. Thank you. The other bit was it had been seen really as a subject in its own right, But it got lumped into this thing that you've probably possibly heard of called Learning for Life and Work, which is comprised of citizenship education, personal development, and employability. And you'll probably have seen courses for a teaching career in Learning for Life and Work advertised in all the universities and teacher training institutions. Well, no, actually you won't, because there aren't any. There is nobody on this planet that I'm aware of who is qualified to teach that range of subjects. There's nothing really holding them together. They're conceptually very different. In terms of methodology, they're very different. And in terms of personal commitment, you will rarely find somebody who is as committed to personal development as they are to citizenship, or vice versa. And if you want to know the difference between those two, citizenship and personal development, the difference essentially is that citizenship is about public policy. What should we do about this? And personal development is about me. What should I do about this? And that makes a very, very clear distinction. And it does undoubtedly, I think, attract very different types of teachers. Okay, curriculum context is a problem. As a result of curriculum context, citizenship typically has a low status in schools. It's not highly regarded by senior management, I don't think, in general. It's not highly regarded by pupils, and very often not by teachers either, not even the teachers who teach it. Yeah, I'll come back to that in a minute as well. That has a number of consequences. One, there are serious weaknesses in training, and I think that is undoubtedly true. I don't think, with a number of notable exceptions, that pre-service training is what it could be in some universities and in teacher training colleges. There's not a great deal of consistency across all of them. In fact, there's not consistency across all of them. It's taught from very different perspectives. Often students get very little time to learn about these issues, even though for them it's probably a brand new subject. They won't have studied much to do with it at university if they've done a degree beforehand. So a lot of it is brand new. So to expect somebody to go in and teach this stuff after maybe a couple of hours session is not really practical. Pre-service or in-service training has now virtually disappeared for citizenship. There's virtually nothing provided in the statutory sector, largely thanks to delays in the implementation of ESA. And also changes in the way in which the boards work. Anything that is done currently is done by voluntary organisations, charities, NGOs, and I think a lot of the work that Sean has been doing has been critical. I don't know, and Bernie as well, and lots of others, but I don't know where else that would be coming from if it wasn't coming from people like you. And I think that's shocking. When you bear in mind how much was originally spent on citizenship, I think that was one of the great triumphs of it. That we got a budget of about, I think it was 1.4 million to provide up to 7 days of training for up to 5 teachers from every school in Northern Ireland, which was the largest in-service training programme ever to take place for a single subject in Northern Ireland, which showed phenomenal commitment from the Department of Education. And then bang, it stops. We've done it, we've introduced a new subject, so we don't need the training for it anymore.
You know, Michael, so I think it shows phenomenal just from an individual within the department.
Yeah.
And that's what you deal with all the time.
Yeah.
Right.
There are then individuals who come in who just were determined
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
finance them.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Because there's a lack of training at pre-service and in-service, there is a serious issue, I believe, with conceptual understanding of some of those key concepts I put up at the beginning. They're not easy concepts. They were never clearly defined in the original curriculum, and deliberately so, because we wanted these to be contested issues that people explored, and we expected them to be given the tools to do that through training, and of course that's not happening. So you're getting, frankly, nonsense being taught in some places by people who don't know what they're meant to be teaching.
I hope you don't mind me interrupting, Michael, but do you remember too, there was always a tension between the flexibility of the of the minimum statement, but then there was always this concern within the establishment, but what are they going to know?
Yeah.
Yes.
We want to know, you know, and the pendulum swung another way where you were itemising the goal. Do you remember
Yes,
that?
absolutely.
Was,
and
you know, And I think that tension's still there.
Yeah. Yeah, and I see there was also, I think it was the Human Rights Commission did a thing about education and the new curriculum, and they commented that political education isn't statutory in this, it's only in guidance, and recommended a change in that. And you can understand those perspectives, but there was an integrity, I think, to it at the time. In terms of management, there are also serious weaknesses. For example, in terms of timetabling, there are a lot of schools who don't have it on the timetable, I think would be fair to say, or it's treated as a cross-curricular subject in many cases. That staffing is a big issue, that often the people who have been trained aren't teaching it anymore, not because they don't want to, but because they're needed for PE on Thursday afternoon or whatever it happens to be. And there's also that perception that anybody can teach it, and anyway, it's not really that important. That perception on behalf of senior management is damaging, there's no doubt, I think, to this day. There's no GCSE in citizenship, which again was one of our high aspirations going back, but what we wanted was something different from your normal GCSE. At the time in England, QCA was introducing quite radical GCSEs that were encouraging different ways of assessment, and we had hoped for something along those lines, but it was not to be. So we've got instead the GCSE in Learning for Life and Work, which is a fine qualification. I would be proud to have it myself. And it reached the stage, I think, where board officers who were responsible for supporting Learning for Life and Work were recommending that teachers don't put their kids through the GCSE. And I would imagine that's still the case. If it's not, it's a shame. One of the things that we really wanted to come out of this infrastructure that you see building here was a sense of professional identity, that teachers would self-identify themselves as citizenship teachers, that there was a professional body of knowledge and skills and a network of people around which information, practice, debate would be exchanged. And that has simply failed to happen. There is no cadre of teachers that identify themselves as citizenship teachers. And I think of all of the things that I've mentioned so far, that's possibly the most damaging element of all of this. Hope this doesn't sound like sour grapes or anything. It's not really intended to be. I'll explain why in a minute or two. I think assessment has been a real problem as well, that they just haven't, I don't think, maybe I'd be interested to have this conversation with Bernie as well, but I don't think they've got it right. I think what we had hoped for with citizenship was that it would be something that kids appreciated as different, and I think they do, but different in the sense as well that you weren't having to learn this body of knowledge so you could sit that test and get such and such a grade or qualification, and I don't think that has worked. Again, Julianne, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong in that, but I'm happy to be argued with. Oh, thank you. I've always felt that, you know. Policy synergies, I think, are also an issue, that there are also a lot of other policy areas that citizenship ought to be interacting with. Like, for example, there's a lot in the CRED policy that is directly and specifically relevant to citizenship education, but those connections are not being made, I don't think. And there are other policy areas. I won't bore you with those, but I think... The
non-formal people, CRED, community relations, equality, diversity.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Sorry. Yes, you're quite right. Thank you. Okay, successes. I would point... most of the information I would have around this would come from an ETI survey report that was done, I think, 2006. Would that be right? Walk around about that. And then an evaluation of the implementation that the University of Ulster carried out a wee while ago. And, you know, despite what I've said, I think there have been a lot of successes. I think one of our highest aspirations for citizenship going back was that we would build on what had been achieved by EMU and enhance provision in that area. And I think that has been done to some degree. Whether it's been done enough is the question. But the University of Ulster, I just wonder how fair that is. You know, we were based at the University of Ulster putting this together, and they said this, that the development programme was a good example of carefully crafted, conceptually sound, evidence-based curriculum development and the effective management of change, which I think to some degree is true. An academic colleague of mine describes the curriculum that was put together as not bad, and I think that's as high a praise as you can get, really, from that particular academic. It's not bad. The management of change was good, but then there came a point when it really went downhill a little bit. Active and participatory approaches are, at least in part due to citizenship curriculum, much more common in schools, I think, than they were. How good they are, there are others, again, who are more qualified to say than I am, but I think that was one of the other successes. And I could name others, but I won't, because I enjoy complaining more than I enjoy celebrating success. No, well, there's one more. Positive impacts on pupils. The inspectorate identified quite clearly that there were quite positive impacts on pupils, and especially around a number of things. The University of Ulster identified an increased interest in politics, which in itself is quite an achievement. Because really, when you think about it, policy is dull. It's long term, it's hard work, and sometimes I wonder why kids should be all that interested in it. Maybe policy isn't that important. Maybe it's about how to change policy is what's important. But anyway, pupils had increased expectations of democracy in schools. They were increasingly cynical about schools' councils that were tokenistic, which is hardly a bad thing. And finally, no, two more after this thing. There was a more positive perception around community relations type issues, that people felt these were more important as a result of participating in citizenship. And finally, I think that's great, that the participation in citizenship decreased trust in political institutions. Kids were beginning to expect more of the institutions that are around them. So those are some of the successes I would have identified. Is that my last slide? I think it is, yeah. Well, there's one more, but it doesn't really matter. Just to say a couple of things in the context of what we've been talking about earlier on today. The whole idea of citizenship in the curriculum for Northern Ireland came from, I think it's fair to say, people like Alan Smith and Carmel Gallagher and Alan McCulley, grow out of a sense of frustration with EMU and what it was achieving and what it wasn't achieving, and out of a sense of frustration with policy in the Department of Education around community relations issues. And I think experience had taught them that changing policy within the department was profoundly difficult and challenging, if at all possible. But what people like the two Allens and Carmel in particular did was they decided that they would create a new model for how this stuff was dealt with in schools, and then they would attempt to sell that working model to the Department of Education. And that strategy ultimately succeeded. And I'm brought back to some of your comments then earlier on, Karen, about, I suppose the essence of it is that policy interventions in these areas have been sporadic. Occasionally there's been great energy and great enthusiasm, a lot of finance put into them, and then it all goes cold. It certainly happened with EMU, and I think the same thing, it's only fair to say, really has happened with citizenship. And it often feels to me that we are back where we were in the mid-90s with EMU, that actually we may not have moved all that far in the interim. A lot of good work has been done, and a lot of good work is being done, but we're maybe not so far away from where we were in the mid-90s.